have some of my toughest critics in the room. I have a handful of current students, and I even saw one former student just sneak in about 3 minutes ago. So, so there's a lot on the line here. I wanted to talk a little bit tonight about our background as a practice, and to kind of couch it within a very particular theme that I think has become a real kind of guiding light for both our practice and for our work. As Hannah mentioned, I'm a co-founding partner of PellOverton Architects. We're an architecture and design firm based here in Providence and in New York, and my partner Tate is here as well. And I moved up to Providence last August, so I'm relatively fresh. And I came up with my wife and our 2 kids, and I was really extremely fortunate that within the first 3 days of being in Providence, I stumbled into Design Week and met a lot of incredible people affiliated with this organization, people who are designers, people who are just interested in design. And so there's been a lot of support for our transition, both as a family, but also as a practice. And so we're just very appreciative to have this opportunity to talk to you tonight. So the theme I want to talk to you about has a little bit to do with our origin story as a practice. Every design practice has some kind of origin story, like a place and a time where it all came together, kind of fermented into the beginnings of something new. For architects, that often happens in graduate school, where you're working together on a project and kind of develop a kinship, or after school working in an office for somebody else and kind of commiserating around the lunch table or over drinks after work about how the boss doesn't know what the hell they're doing. For us, our origin story, meaning Tate and I, our origin story actually has nothing to do with architecture. And to go there requires a bit of a flashback to 1999, which is the eve of Y2K, for those of you who remember that, don't know what that is. And I hesitate to show you this next image, but I'm going to anyways. So Tate and I met because we both were and still are musicians. And we played together in a band for 5 years, every week, writing, recording, performing music. And I mention this because we weren't just musicians, we were jazz musicians, or at least we fancied ourselves to be that. And that's important because as jazz musicians, we were playing music that was both instrumental and improvisational. And those 2 things have been really kind of central to the development of our practice, the way we communicate with each other, but also the way we think about our work and the kind of themes that carry through our work. So our creative partnership began as a musical one, where we're actually practicing communicating non-verbally and responsively every week for several years. Of course, eventually we did talk about architecture, and though we didn't set out to model our practice or our work on our musical dialogue, today it really is apparent to us how important the concepts of improvisation, kind of responsive communication, non-verbal communication, how important those concepts have been in our work. In design terms, there may be, we can kind of identify 3 underlying questions in our work. The first is, how might the design environment communicate with or otherwise engage its inhabitants? Could materials and forms be active participants in the life of a space? And can we think of what we design as providing the infrastructure for a kind of ongoing improvisation? So tonight I just want to briefly introduce kind of salient points of 3 very different projects, or 1 very different project and 2 that are a little bit more similar, to try and track through how some of these ideas and questions have played out in the built environment. The first project was an installation design for a gallery in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We were approached by the Bridge Gallery, invited to exhibit our work. For better or worse, at the time, and even still today, we didn't have exhibition-grade models to put on pedestals or beautiful prints to frame. So instead, we tried to think about a site-specific installation that could demonstrate in an active way the kinds of interests that span across our work. So rather than showing our work, like here's a bunch of buildings, here's a bunch of interiors, we tried to come up with an installation that kind of spoke in nonverbal ways about the things that we were interested in architecture. To try and situate that idea within the context of a gallery that sees itself as a bridge between art and architecture, hence the name Bridge Gallery, We looked at paintings by some 19th century artists such as Caspar David Friedrich, Gustave Courbet, who exhibited what we thought of as kind of similar sensibilities about atmosphere and environment. So while we see objects in the foreground, 3 deer, there's a kind of sympathy between the scale of the deer, the color of the deer, the scale of the trees, the scale of the bushes, the rocks. They all kind of blend together into a field. And so this kind of oscillation between figure and field generated a kind of effect that we thought was interesting and that we wanted to kind of explore in our work. To start with, the installation was designed as 2 spaces, small and large, which were intended to function as 2 separate exhibition spaces or kind of combined as 1 large exhibition space. And the installation components were thought of as different surface types based on their kind of techniques of assembly and the kind of effects that they produce. So I think this is a pointer. Yeah. So the 4 different surface types. Reflective, so there's a long kind of mirrored bar that also functioned as a DJ bar, booth of course. A mirrored ceiling panel that was suspended. So those are the reflected surfaces. A series of printed surfaces that would either have kind of large scale prints on them or prints on the back side of the panels that would be backlit. Planted walls where actual plants would grow through, cutouts made into the surfaces, and then an assembled wall where fabric or textile was kind of woven together to display information about the exhibition. These were designed to overlap visually throughout the gallery to create a sense of movement and recurring motifs that adjusted constantly as you move through the space. The idea was to foster a different kind of engagement between observers and the gallery through a kind of nonverbal expression using color, pattern, and texture, which could create mood in the room rather than focus on particular objects. Along those lines, we tried to think of the installation as having a split personality, assertive and present sometimes, and a kind of passive background other times, hence the name passive-aggressive. In the aggressive mode, the exhibit brings the figural qualities of the installation to the foreground as motifs that are constantly adjusting from botanical figures that appear as flat patterns, sometimes printed on a surface or projected from behind, sometimes cut into a screen to reveal real flowers that grow through the screen and transform the graphic into a kind of living wallpaper, and sometimes simply reflected in the mirrored surfaces of the bar, the ceiling panels up above. In the passive mode, the installation serves as background for other activities or exhibitions in the space by providing both atmosphere and shape to the gallery. So here we have an image of the smaller gallery space that's enclosed with the printed and planted floral screens, the mirror finished stainless steel bar in the foreground with a peace lily growing out of one end. And a view from the street where the reflective ceiling panels that are folded kind of conflate images of the planted wall, the planted bar, the printed wall, as well as passersby on the street. They're kind of projected into the space through the folds of the reflective surface. These are some snapshots of a 5 by 5 by 8 foot section of the installation that we could actually afford to build. This is for the Architectural League Young Architects Award. And we were given a little bit of money to try and construct as much of the installation as possible. And so what we have is the planted wall here with the peace lilies growing through it, a printed surface that's backlit, and the stainless steel, a 2 foot long stainless steel section of the stainless steel mirror finished bar with a peace lily. We learned through this process that the installation costs about $2,000 a linear foot, so we didn't get much further than this. But we got some great photos of it, and the kinds of effects that we were interested in that you see here. Again, the kind of conflation of the different imagery, which change ideally as you move through the gallery, but also the kind of oscillation of panels that are lit, not lit, the flowers that actually grow through the panels and lend an actual kind of organic dimension to the experience of the space. In many ways, this project was foundational for us as we began to think about how spaces and materials could work to promote engagement between users and their surroundings. And this interest, in turn, has guided our practice more and more to working with educational and creative nonprofits, where design really has the opportunity to engage larger communities. What we found, particularly in educational circles, is a really vibrant conversation about how the design of a physical environment can support current pedagogical models about both autonomy and collaboration in student work, structure and freedom, formal and informal exchange. And for us, those kinds of, that kind of dialogue or those kinds of dualities in education reflect music in many ways, and the ways in which musicians communicate and operate together. So for us, I think that that's been a really kind of powerful transition to built work at a larger scale. Sticking with the playground theme, one important precedent for us has been adventure playgrounds, which were were kind of emerged at the end of the Second World War in Berlin and London. And these were urban play spaces that were built by children for children, typically with very limited infrastructure. So a pit, a pole, a ladder, maybe a platform of some sort, but the kind of light infrastructure that fostered a certain amount of appropriation and improvisation on the part of children who were making these spaces for themselves. So in exploring this concept as a kind of pivot into developing an architecture that is thought of as being infrastructural, I wanted to talk about two projects briefly. The first of which is a project we completed a few years ago in East Harlem for the Kennedy Child Study Center. This is a 25,000 square foot school for children with developmental disabilities. It's distributed on 2 floors of an old 1930s warehouse. And the building came with lots of problems, mostly environmental. But spatially, the biggest problem was that the lower floor was only 7 foot 6 inches tall. So that's about this tall. But what we discovered upon our first walkthrough of the site, and this is after some of the demolition, was that this old warehouse buildings like this have these massive wood frame construction. And the joist depth that presented seemed to us to hold a lot of potential for accessible space. I mean, clearly above the plane of the ceiling, but something that was kind of untapped potential that normally just gets hidden. So this led to the design of a series of large, ultimately colorful lighting bays that were cut between the joists and distributed throughout the lower floor, effectively to create the perception of greater height and illumination from above. So this was obviously just a little study model, but in the finished space you can see a blue lighting bay at the entrance, a yellow, green, another yellow one in the back. And these were distributed throughout the space on this floor, in the admin office spaces as well. And in day one, when we walked through this space with the board chair, he's probably 7 feet tall. He said there was absolutely no way that we'd be able to make this a habitable space. And the client got this for a song. I mean, the landlord was also convinced there was no way we could make this occupiable. And we made them believers somehow. So it was an effective strategy. But it wasn't just about creating a kind of spatial strategy to alleviate the height issue. We saw it as an opportunity to think through how the environment might engage the students on a daily basis. And so the lighting bays on the second floor, each bay is given one of 4 colors, and those colors correspond to ceiling panels that are painted in the classrooms on the upper floor. The idea being that in the morning, when students arrive on the lobby level, they gather to meet their teacher underneath a colored lighting bay that corresponds to their given classroom. They go upstairs, there's a kind of cognitive link between one ceiling and another. At the end of the day, they come back downstairs, they're picked up by their parents, or they get on the bus and they go home. The idea being that this is a very kind of light touch way of allowing the environment to promote a kind of engagement between the user that they experience as part of their daily routine. Color was also used in the project as a signifier for moments of engagement between the community and the school. Places where the physical environment becomes an active player in the conversation. For instance, a series of built-in orange seating along the window wall, which sponsors opportunities for one-on-one conversation between staff and parents, or moments where the staff directly interfaces with parents coming into the lobby. This is an area where there's family services back here. Oftentimes there's staff standing here to greet parents and children as they come in, passing out literature. Here's a detail of one of the benches by the window wall. And this other element, this kind of large stair in the middle of the space, which not only connects the lower floor therapy rooms and offices and lobby to the upstairs classrooms, but also serves as a hub for student work on display and serves informally as a kind of large piece of infrastructure for staff to sit on for meetings, informal meetings at the end of the day. So part of it is trying to get architecture to do double duty, so it's a stair, but it's also a mini amphitheater. But also thinking about ways in which the architecture serves as a kind of support or kind of scaffold for the very specific activities of the organization. And this last image of this project, which just kind of, this section illustrates that stair and the relationship, the kind of sight lines to the presenter at the bottom with a whiteboard behind her. And then you can see the kind of drastic differences between the lower floor at 7'6" and the upper floor at 14 feet, where conversely we actually had to bring the ceiling down in order to make the scale of the space more suitable for young students. So you can see the kind of modulations of the ceiling in the hallway versus the classrooms, and then the lighting bays that are cut in here. The third and last project I wanted to show you is a smaller school expansion project that we completed last year for Blue School, which is an independent school in the South Street Seaport of Manhattan that currently lives in this 6-story building, which was designed by Polshek in the 90s. It's actually a very well-known building for architects in New York, mostly because of this boat that sits on top. But a couple of years ago, the adjacent 2-story building became available, which was a former 1940s era frozen seafood warehouse. And I don't think I have any before photos of the interior, but it was basically just an enormous freezer with some offices on the second floor. This building also was plagued with lots of problems. I mean, I think in part because we do a lot of school work, which tends to require large spaces, and we work in a lot of buildings, old buildings in New York. Most of the work that we do tends to be adaptive reuse. And so that in and of itself is challenging, but also incredibly thrilling. This project, this building, the issues this building brought to bear almost warranted tearing the whole thing down. And as you can see, it wouldn't take much. One of the problems was that there was no ADA accessibility into the building, which is problematic for lots of reasons. There was no outdoor space. There was no easy connection between the two buildings. You can see that the floors are totally misaligned. But one of the primary opportunities that the building presented were these 2 large loading docks, which is a really unusual opportunity in New York. And so the first move was to think about how that loading dock, particularly the larger one, could provide us with an opportunity to create a kind of permeable boundary between the interior of the school, the kind of inner workings, the day-to-day activity of the school, and the surrounding neighborhood. And Blue School in particular, and you can see the 6-story building in the background, Blue School has a kind of outward-facing ethos. They're very well liked in the community, and this was really an opportunity to put a particular space, a particular program piece, which in this case was the STEAM lab or the makerspace, on display, 50 inches off the ground, virtually on stage for the neighborhood. So it's become a really amazing way for the building to kind of communicate its daily business to the surrounding neighborhood. The other loading dock was then dropped to grade to create an ADA accessible entry. And here's an image of the interior of that makerspace. In addition to creating space for 4 new classrooms, you can see those here. There's one on the first floor and 3 more on the second floor, and then a connection between the 2 buildings on that floor. We tried to find opportunities to tuck kind of informal learning spaces into the nooks and crannies of the building. I mean, one of the other drawbacks of this building is that it's 2,400 square foot floor plate, which is quite small. It's probably a third of the size of the space that we're in right now. So sticking 4 classrooms, a makerspace, a bunch of private offices, and promote degrees of interaction and exchange between students, staff, parents at different scales, as a way of allowing the kind of learning that goes on every day to move out of the classrooms proper and to really permeate the whole building, to think about the whole building as one continuous learning environment. So you can see these kinds of nooks and crannies, stairwells, built-in seating as kind of on the periphery of larger spaces. In this case, to think back to the kinds of infrastructural pieces that the Adventure Playgrounds used, very few items were really necessary to set up the opportunity for conversation. So in this case, this kind of nook in the corner, color, some built-in seating and storage, even just a change in flooring material to designate this as a special space off to the side, dedicated lighting. On the second floor, otherwise unused corner. This is the connection to the 6-story building through here with an ADA lift, which is how we dealt with the offset of the floors. Really very few kind of light touch infrastructural pieces. Built-in millwork that's part library, part bleacher seating, lighting, a whiteboard to allow students to work within the context of a small group conversation. So thinking about how these corners might be activated in ways that can sponsor the interaction really supports the daily function of the school. And this thinking extends to the roof as well, which was removed and rebuilt and rethought of as a series of outdoor instructional spaces that you see here, kind of defined by the edges of benches, a change in flooring material, plantings that provide a certain amount of enclosure, and then recreational space as well in the back, which the school desperately needed. So a couple of images of that. And again, it takes very little in terms of setting up the infrastructure for those conversations, but an exterior blackboard, a couple of benches. Obviously January is not the best time to photograph a roof garden. But again, these kinds of set pieces that really don't have to be much in terms of sponsoring the kinds of appropriation and improvisation that we find so interesting about these kinds of projects. So the last 2 images I wanted to show you, this is a photograph from last month actually. There's an organization in New York called Playground NYC that we've been working with for the past year. They have developed and maintained an adventure playground on Governor's Island that's free and open to the public. Their big thing is risk over hazard, setting up opportunities for children's self-guided exploration and play. We've been working with them on developing a mobile unit that they can take around the city to parks or to neighborhoods that have fewer resources, and also working with them to develop these kinds of pop-up programs. Typically, the adventure playground in Governor's Island has, discarded planks with nails sticking out of them, and it really is risk. This is the light touch version of it, which is cardboard and tape, maybe some scissors. But this image for us in many ways is a kind of powerful, it's kind of a powerful reflection about, dialogue between structure and freedom and form and improvisation, again, that we find so kind of central to the way that we think as a partnership, but also the way that we think spaces should be used.